Leadership fascinates me. I feel very fortunate over the last 17 years. I've been able to spend a lot of my time and effort and energy exploring the topic of leadership. From interviewing senior executives to working with leaders who clear snow from roads in Pennsylvania during winter storms, to conducting empirical research, and to coaching and working in the context of leadership development programs with everyone from CEOs down to frontline managers. And one of the topics that's been particularly interesting to me over the last number of years that I want to share with you today is what makes great leaders even better, and what makes mediocre leaders even better. In other words, how does leadership develop? And so we've been questioning this and talking with people and looking at the research, and we've gleaned 3 things that leaders who develop do, and do differently from those who don't. And I want to share with you those 3 things today over the next few minutes. So this scenario plays out day in and day out all over the world in schools. You have 2 students who are, you see it's the same picture, who are, for all intents and purposes, identical. They start out with the same level of ability. But if we look at them 8 weeks later, one student has made significant progress, and another has either stayed the same or maybe just made a modicum, a tiny bit of progress. Now, what causes this? What are the things that might differentiate people who are able to learn, or in this context, students who are able to learn math, from students who are able not to learn math? Of course, you're probably thinking there could be a whole host of reasons, such as, were they fed breakfast? What do we know about their home life? Maybe there's something about the teacher. Starting in the 1970s, Carol Dweck started a fascinating series of studies that has at least a partial answer to this question of why some students get better at math and others don't. And it starts from the belief in whether math is a developable skill, or if you hold to the idea of you're either good at math or you're not. If you hold to the belief that math is a developable skill, it turns out that when you can't solve a problem, you try and find strategies to solve it next time. You don't get put back by setbacks, and you look for opportunities to develop that skill. When you see math skills as something innate in you, that you're either good at it or you're not, you try to prove yourself when you're confident that you can do it, but you don't look for opportunities to develop and grow. So it's no surprise that the student on the left, in this example, has a growth mindset, sees math skills as something that can be developed. In other words, what you think, your cognitions set the framework for whether or not you can get better and how much you do get better. Now, we can think of this in the context of students, but this is a real problem and a real issue. And companies like Microsoft, I was speaking recently with an executive at Microsoft who told me, we're wrestling with this every day. How do we show up to work in a company that's known for many years for doing the same thing over and over again to developing ourselves and thinking new and innovating in an industry where we have to be different. So how do we challenge ourselves on a daily basis to grow? The 3 points that differentiate those leaders who are able to get better are the view of leadership as a practice. The second point, which I will explain, is that they are able to outsmart IKEA. And the third point is that they're authentic, but not too authentic. So over the next few minutes, let's explore each of these. So let me ask, in the context of leadership then, we've been talking about this in the context of maybe personal growth and development, as well as math skills. Can you develop leadership? So I hear a yes, thank you. I think this is probably not the average audience, right? We are here at Lead 2017, and many of you are in HR and hold this notion that yes, it can be developed. Many of you, in fact, are engaged in developing leadership in your organizations in a significant way. But if we were to take stock of people in your organizations, and when we ask people this question, a lot of times they're saying to themselves, well, I guess, but I'm not sure if I really believe that. And of course, your innate skills and abilities are clearly very important. No one would ever say that they're not. But a significant portion of leadership can be developed. And I want to go over a few examples of what that actually looks like. But there's a few things that I think we need to be in our organizations aware of that are hindering us from having a growth mindset about leadership and leadership development. And they are a focus on traits. So when we think about great leaders and we study great leaders and people give their ideas of how to describe a great leader, they focus on things like confident, strong, strategic, a whole host of traits. Okay, so if I'm trying to get better at leadership and I need to be more strategic, a lot of where people go wrong is, or where people fall off and say, I can't really get better at it, is that what would I actually do to get better at being seen as more strategic? Or what about charisma? That's certainly not something you can get better at. So we focus on traits rather than behaviors or skills. And so what I'm suggesting is that part of getting people able to move and believe that leadership can be developed, which will then lead to them developing their leadership, is challenging their false beliefs about what leadership is. Of course, leaders often have these kinds of traits, but when we think about leadership as a process and leadership as a series of traits and skills that can be developed, then it becomes possible. So perhaps we can unlock possibilities for increased leadership development in our organizations by being crystal clear on what leadership is and making it less about who you are and less of a focus on people like Elon Musk, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Dalai Lama, who there is much to learn from, but that person certainly is not like me. What we have seen then in the most effective leaders is that they view leadership then as a practice. It's a practice which requires deliberate, intentional, daily routines. It often isn't linear. Some days you have a bad day. But they see themselves as practitioners, as practicers of leadership. And there are a lot of interesting parallels between the yoga world and leadership in this sense, in that even master instructors who engage in yoga every day, they don't talk about being a yoga teacher. They talk about the practice of yoga, their practice of yoga. What if we saw leadership that way and saw it as a practice that we're going to have to get a little bit better at every day, that we can make small tweaks and adjustments that may have a big impact? What we believe about leadership matters. But it's also important that we focus on skills. So how do we outsmart IKEA? How many of you have shopped at IKEA before? Okay, so many of you. If you have not, you may have nonetheless had an experience of purchasing something to get it home, to then realize that the setup maybe isn't quite going to go as easily as you thought it did. So picture this scenario. You've just bought this fantastic room with a wardrobe and a dresser and a bed, and you get it home, and what do they give you? What does IKEA give you to set it up? A hex key or an Allen key. So how am I supposed to set up this entire room with this one tool? And you find that, well, in theory it might work, but you're actually going to need some other tools. You may need a level. You may need a hammer. You might, hopefully not, even need a saw. And the best leaders don't try to build a room with a hex key. Those leaders who get better continually recognize the importance of not only having tools, having new tools, different tools, but knowing and practicing how to use them. And they get really specific in terms of what the skills and behaviors are. And I want to talk about 2 leadership skills and behaviors that are developable, that I believe that if that we know are developable, and I believe are commonly misunderstood as not being developable, right? So, charisma. Can you develop charisma? Charisma has often been described as the it factor, someone that draws you to someone. And we know effective leaders, leaders who exhibit charisma are seen as more effective. Now that can, we know, sometimes be used for bad as well as good, right? But charisma is a significant plus factor in the context of leadership. But can it be developed? John Antonakis, a few years ago in Switzerland, did actually a series of fascinating studies looking at what this might actually look like. And so he took a group of people at the start and divided them in half. And just like you would do a study to evaluate the efficacy of a new drug, you take one group and you either do a fake training of some kind with them or no training at all. And then the other group, you give them charismatic leadership tactic training. So it turns out that we often think of charisma as this big thing that is only the domain of fantastic leaders who are great orators, who are persuasive extroverts. And it turns out that charisma is accessible to all of us, including those of you and in your organizations who are introverted. Those of you who aren't quite so sure and have never seen yourself as charismatic. Now, we're not saying that we can take someone from here and build them up to be the most charismatic person and leader that you've ever seen, but we can make a significant nudge. And when you break it down, charisma actually has a number of specific components. So charismatic leaders use metaphors, similes, and analogies. They use personal stories. They talk about shared history within their organization or within their team. They use repetition. They use specific gestures to show that they're engaged. And so we can take this amorphous thing called charisma, say, that isn't me. What would happen if we teach people these tactics? And it's not just about learning by someone telling you about them. What does it involve? Deliberate, intentional practice. And when we do this in our programs, in some of our leadership development programs at the FIU Center for Leadership, we see people take and make baby steps toward this. They take this idea of vision and they, wait, so that's my job? Huh. Well, let's try it. In the Antonakis study, half of the group received the treatment, half of the group received no treatment. What was the result? So it turns out that this top circle is the group who received the training, and the green are the people who are now above average in terms of leadership ratings. The group that received training on charismatic leadership tactics, down the road at some point, 65% of them are now above average, are seen as above average leaders. For the group that received no training, it was 35%. So the mean change from time 1 and time 2. And where were the effective leaders found? The effective leaders who were randomly placed in that group, but who had received the training, were significantly improved in their leadership. Okay, so our room is structured okay that you won't poke someone's eye out when you do this next task. If you could you please raise your pointer finger and put it right in front of you, like right directly in front of you. Now, don't look at your finger, but look sort of through your finger. And take it and draw an arc all the way to the corner, right to that point where it disappears. Maybe play with it a little bit. You see that point where it disappears? Right at the edge there? So there's an area where it hasn't disappeared yet, where we can still see it, but not that well. That is, of course, part of our peripheral vision, way off in our peripheral vision. It turns out that when you are stressed, when you are highly anxious, you can see stuff that's out in the corner, but you don't see things out in the corner. In other words, your brain is not paying attention to those things when you are stressed. The same thing happens psychologically. The exact same thing happens psychologically, and it looks something like this. Okay, so when we are stressed, when we are anxious, we're operating on go, and we're looking at immediate goals, and we're operating according to things as usual. Now, tell me about the context of your work and in your organizations. How many of you is this good enough? In a rapidly dynamic, in a changing environment where there's strategic change, there's shifting allegiances and new competition, there may be new regulations coming down the pike, and you need to adapt and discover new processes. When you are in an emotional state that is heightened, you're not paying attention to these things on your periphery, which will make you a more important leader, which will make you a more effective leader. And what you are missing is, when you see the tunnel, when you see through a tunnel, is only a portion of the picture. When in reality, you might be climbing the wrong mountain. You're not seeing the sky. You're not seeing the green grass and the valleys and the stream, which is what is required for effective leadership. Now, some of you may be familiar with this idea before, but what leaders often forget is that their job is to ensure that their team is in the right place to see the whole picture. So we can learn charisma and vision. We can develop that. We can also develop our ability to be an emotional thermostat for our team. And what does a thermostat do? It not only takes the temperature of your team, the emotional temperature of your team, but it seeks to regulate it. And we might use things like mindfulness or our emotional intelligence to do these things, but we often think of them only as something that we do ourselves, not as something that leaders need to do for the team. So when you introduce the idea of this to people, that a leader needs to engage in a thermostat function of taking the emotional temperature of their team, they're able to understand that part of what their job now is to regulate their own emotions, not for themselves and not understand them for their team, but put their team in the right place to get what needs to get done. Now, sometimes that isn't just reducing anxiety. Sometimes you need to kick people's butt, right? Sometimes you need to get people in the right space to act and to act quickly. And the way this works is through the process of emotional contagion. That the emotions that you show are highly, highly contagious. Now, that's a tall order for leaders to have to think about. So now you're saying I need to regulate and control my emotions, not only for myself, but thinking about this for the context of the team? Absolutely. It's a developable skill. The thermostat function of leadership. And the third point is to be authentic, but not too authentic. There's a big push, and some of you, probably many of you are familiar with authenticity. And it's based on the idea that we need to be ourselves. But this strange thing happens that when we are seeking to grow, it doesn't feel authentic when we try new behaviors. I remember the first time I was teaching a group of CEOs. I sure didn't feel authentic. It didn't feel comfortable to me. But somewhere along the lines, I learned new skills, and I also changed. So we have to be careful when we think of authenticity, that we need to know who we are, and we need to leverage our best version of ourselves for that. But we can't be so obsessed with authenticity that we don't try new things that may significantly amplify our leadership. So the best leaders who continually develop see leadership as a practice, as a daily, deliberate, intentional act of making small adjustments to get better. They use a host of tools at their disposal and try to get new tools and get really specific about what those tools are. And not just say, I need to be more charismatic, but let's think about this and let's practice this. And they're authentic. They don't change their core values and ideas, but they're not so authentic that they become rigid and fail to develop. So I wonder if you are able to think about these three factors as you seek to develop your leadership or in your organizations. How can you implement these three principles and ideas to amplify your organization's leadership, sometimes with very small actions? Thank you.